Neon Green Network begrüßt die Prozessanwältin und Umweltaktivistin Polly Higgins.
When I was 16, I punched my art teacher so hard he ended up on the ground. Half an hour later, I ended up outside the school gates. Now, what I did then actually stopped a cycle of abuse. What I was doing was I was standing up for something that I perceived to be an injustice. And in fact, what was happening was that younger boys at the school I was at there was a lot of violence in the school. They were being abused by the teachers. And rather than seeing a young boy being punched by a man twice his size and definitely 4 times his weight, I weighed in there instead. Now, I'm not proud of what I did then, but it did inform me in a number of ways. What was so interesting then was that my parents didn't understand that I was standing up for an injustice, and my teachers didn't want to hear my voice or my side of the story. And I ended up at a very different school instead. So I ended up at a new school, and it was a new school that was run in a very different way. Instead of using violence, instead of using command and control, it was a school that entrusted its pupils to put their skills to the best possible use they could. And in that environment, I flourished. I greatly enjoyed, and I succeeded. I gained far better results there. I was far happier. I felt valued, unlike my earlier school where I felt very undervalued. It's perhaps no surprise that I ended up a barrister, because what I learned was meeting violence with violence does not solve a problem. And it's perhaps no surprise that in turn I decided to look to words as my tools, as an effective way of bringing forward injustices. Now, what I saw back then in the school that I was first at was a gross injustice. It was a cycle of abuse that needed to be halted. In fact, what I did was I stood up and I said no. I did it in a very violent way myself, but I essentially said, enough, no more. This has to stop. And it did break that cycle in due time. It brought it out into the open. Now what I see is a very similar cycle that's at play here in the world. It's a cycle of harm, of destruction. It's a cycle of abuse at play to the earth itself. And again, I say, enough, no more. Some years back, when I was actually on a platform not so dissimilar to this, and I was speaking about an earlier idea that I had proposed to the United Nations, which was to afford the earth the right to life, I had a light bulb moment. It was one of those moments when quite literally the light seems to go on in your head. Someone in the audience made a comment about how we needed a new language to stop this mass damage and destruction that was playing out. And I found myself thinking, yes, it's like genocide. It's ecocide. That should be a crime. And what I did was, I rushed back. In fact, it was the climate negotiations up in Copenhagen when this happened. And I rushed back to my flat in London, and I subjected the idea to intense legal scrutiny for 3 solid months. And what I discovered was that not only was this legally doable, but in fact it was a necessity, but more than that, it could be done relatively easily. And what I did was, I went back to possibly the single most important international legal document that we have that covers right across the world. It's called the Rome Statute. And the Rome Statute sets out what is known as the crimes against peace. And those crimes are known as crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and the most recent one has been named crimes of aggression, the precursor to war. Now, those 4 crimes are collectively known as crimes that protect the well-being of life. And to me, what I saw was that there was a missing crime here, a missing 5th crime against peace, and that was ecocide, the well-being of all life. So I proposed to the United Nations Law Commission back in end of April 2010 that to the Rome Statute there be an amendment. We don't need to write whole new conventions or treaties, but to the one document that creates international crime, we amend it and we add in ecocide. What happened next was truly remarkable. My life changed completely, almost overnight. But one of the things that came out of it was that a journalist from the Baltic states got in touch to say, did I know that when this document, the Rome Statute, was being drafted, that in fact, ecocide had already been there. It was part of it. For 11 years, from the mid-1980s to 1996, when hundreds, if not thousands, of special rapporteurs, member state representatives, lawyers, and other UN-related organizations were involved in the drafting of this document, ecocide was part of that document. But in 1996, that one international crime was quite literally wiped off. And we have the documentation to show when and how that happened. University of London very kindly undertook phenomenal research and went into the basements of the UN, and we now have a paper trail of evidence. Actually, it goes back to 1972 when there was a draft convention on ecocide first proposed. So this is the thing, this law of ecocide, there's nothing new about it. I didn't know about it at the time. But sometimes this happens with a good idea. You try and push it down over here, and it has a habit of popping up over here. This is an idea of its time. And indeed, Austria had a very important part to play in that. Austria was the country that stood up and said, ecocide is not necessarily a crime of intent. What they understood was that ecocide often is a crime of consequence. They understood that actually an awful lot of ecocide happens at a corporate level, but it's not intended. We don't have CEOs and directors sitting down saying, what are we going to destroy today? It's the unintended consequence. Now, did you know this? It is the law for every CEO and his or her directors to put the interests of their shareholders first. And of course, when that happens, we put profit above people and planet. So law has created this problem, and law can amend it. It can change it. Thank you. What I see playing out today is a hermetically sealed cycle of damage and destruction. Where we have damage and destruction, it leads to, amongst other things, resource depletion, which leads to conflict, which then leads to war, which leads to more damage and destruction, more resource depletion, more conflict, more war. In fact, we've even had 2 wars already that are called resource wars. Darfur was a war over water. Iraq, a war over oil. But here's the thing. It's not about slowing down that cycle. It's about disrupting it completely. And when we disrupt that cycle of harm, when we say enough, no more, This must stop. Then we create the space for something else to happen. And that's very important. And this is where law can be a very powerful tool. Because law can act as the disruptor. But I can't do that on my own. I can't do that in isolation. What it needs is people to stand up. We can be the disruptors. We can be the voice that can take this forward. Now, this is the beginnings of the proposal that was submitted into the United Nations, the definition of the law of ecocide, as I proposed it. But rather than take you through the detail of that, and you can find a lot of information on that on the website eradicatingecocide.com, what I'd like to do is invite you to feel, as I did, when I first saw and experienced ecocide. I'm going to take you on a journey here, from inside here, the Hofburg Palace, and we're going to travel out from here, hopefully, yes. And we're going to travel and have a look at a couple of ecocides that are playing out right now as we sit here today. This is the Alberta Tar Sands in Canada, which was once arboreal wetlands and ancient forests. Over the last 40,000 years, has now become a desecrated landscape. And that's us returning. But we're going to take off again, yeah. And this is, of course, the Amazon. Gosh, what happened there? When I first saw pictures of both these places, what it made me feel knows no words. That sense, deep knowing that this must stop. Destroy the very land that we walk on, and we destroy our ability to live in peaceful enjoyment. And that in itself really helped shape and bring forward my pursuit for justice and my pursuit for the legislation, the law, the international law that can actually help change the world to make it a better place. But I'd like to take you back in time. I'd like to take you back 200 years ago to a time when we enslaved something else. We enslaved people just by dint of their color. Being black, you were branded, you were chained. There was one man who stood up in my country, in Britain, to speak out about this. His name was Wilberforce, and he was a British parliamentarian. And at a very young age, he stood up and said, "Enough, no more. This must stop." He understood, he knew, he felt at a very deep level how wrong this was. What was so remarkable was that William Wilberforce, when he stood up and he did that, he emboldened and he encouraged others to do the same. It wasn't just William Wilberforce, of course, who stood up to stand out and speak out. In fact, slaves themselves had started to riot. Many people in many cities and many countries around the world acted as voices on behalf of those slaves whose voices were not being heard over there. But we, the people, could speak out and say, "Enough, no more." What is truly remarkable about that story is that Vienna had a very important part in it. In 1815, the very document that was signed that brought about the ending of slavery happened here in this city. And in fact, the decision was made just across the road in the Federal Chancellor's office. So you carry a history, a legacy of being a great nation and effecting the end, bringing about the end of an era of slavery. But what was so remarkable about that time was what was objected to when those who did stand up and give voice on behalf of slaves, what was said in response to that, the reaction that came from industry. Industry said, you can't stop slavery, it's a necessity, the public demand it, it will lead to economic collapse. Well, compare that to today. Instead of it being a black in chains that's enslaved, we're looking at the black soils here of the Alberta Tar Sands. This is a toxic tailing pond. Those arguments, they look familiar, don't they? In fact, industry proposed self-regulation. We don't want anything mandatory. Leave it to us to sort out on a voluntary basis. We will limit the numbers of slaves. We'll create an internal trading system, a cap and trade, if you like. But leave it to the market forces to sort this out. Well, it was recognized that that would never work and that it would take law to stop this. And this is the thing, law is a very powerful tool, and it can be a tool for a force for life-affirming systems, or it can be a tool for force for life-destroying systems. Think back to slavery and look at this picture here. Slavery very much was in that area of looking at human beings and treating human beings as a piece of property, a commodity. You impose a value, a price tag. You can buy, you can sell, you can use, you can abuse with impunity. This is precisely what's happening to the earth today. And in fact, if we look at climate negotiations, that is the space that it's in. It's the law of property and ownership. Who has the rights, the silent right to destroy? But there is another way. And laws are there to deal with this. In fact, view the earth as a living being rather than a thing. And what happens is, we come from a very different place. We flip our way of thinking. And we understand that we come from a position of trusteeship, of guardianship, of stewardship. And when we do that, it comes from a very different place. It's not just about profit. In fact, it's about what we care about. It comes from here. It comes from the heart. And that's a legal term, a legal duty of care. And when we do that, we no longer just look at the bottom line. What we do is, instead of looking at the quarterly returns, the annual returns, we look to 7 generations hence. And we say, will this have unintended consequences at a later date that we don't know how to accommodate? Will this have unintended consequences here, now, in our lifetimes? But it's more than that. This is about a shift in values. This is about a fundamental shift away from an imposed value, the price tag of ecosystem services, and it's the recognition of the intrinsic value in and of itself of the earth. And international criminal law recognizes that. We don't pay fines with international criminal law. We draw a line in the sand and we say, no more. This cycle of harm must stop here and now. And that is the power of international criminal law. It takes us into a place where we come from a position of trusteeship rather than ownership. But this isn't just about law. It's about leadership. It's about leadership in our heads of state. It's about leadership in me. It's about leadership in you, in all of us. And this is the thing I realized quite a while ago, that to put in place an international law of ecocide would command from each and every one of us strong, bold, and courageous leadership. This is something that really demands upon us, calls upon us, to stand up and say, enough, no more, this must stop. This is about breaking that cycle of harm and destruction. Now, not one of us comes to the table with clean hands in this. This is not a blame game. And in fact, last year, I was invited in by 54 nations to legally advise on the International Law of Ecocide. A concept paper was requested by a group of nations, and we took that into every single government in the world, setting out a timeline between now and 2020 to put in place an international law of ecocide. It can be done. But what I'm asking is for each of us to dare to be great. You see, this is the thing. I am here. This is my comfort zone. But the magic, it happens over here. This is about us stepping out of our comfort zone and standing up and saying, no more, this must stop. This is about us breaking the cycle of harm that is happening and accruing here. And this is very important because when we do that, we actually become empowered, and magic does happen when we say, enough, this must stop. Now, each of us has either willingly or unwillingly, unknowingly, knowingly, been at the receiving end of abuse or actually been an abuser. We can do that without even realizing. But the important thing is when we stand up and we say, no more. And this is about doing it really at a global level and doing it with the law of ecocide. Here is my wish. My wish is that we end the era of ecocide by 2020. It can be done. And I truly believe that we are at a very special moment in time when each and every one of us has the option, has the choice to stand up and speak up and be a voice, just as those people did 200 years ago when they ended the era of slavery. And we can do the same again when we end the era of ecocide. Look at the tar sands. Look at genetically modified organisms. Look at nuclear. All of these are life-compromising systems. Just imagine, had the law of ecocide been put in place in the mid-90s, where we would be now. Genetically modified organisms, oil, nuclear would be no longer. Now, this is a country that has already given voice and said, we want to end the era of genetically modified organisms, of nuclear. You are a country that knows how to stand up and say, enough, this must stop. Now, I call upon Austria to demonstrate great leadership once again. I believe it can be done. 200 years ago, it was here in this very city, just across the road, where the decision was made to end the era of slavery. Now, that Federal Chancellor's Department can make that decision to be great again by calling on all leaders who are signatories to the Rome Statute to stand up and say, enough, this must stop. Let us put in place a law of ecocide. So I say this from a place of peace, because ultimately this isn't just about a crime against nature. It's about a crime against humanity, and it's a crime against future generations. But ultimately, it's about stopping that cycle of harm, of damage and destruction that leads to conflict and war. It is, most importantly, a crime against peace. Thank you.